Hello everyone, this is the student of rhythm again. There's a small group of people who are all related to each other either by blood or by marriage, and they set out to make a new life for themselves in an unfamiliar land. They come from living a life with some level of wealth and sophistication, beneficiaries of a civilization and culture that cherishes tales of past splendor and glorious destiny. But they've come to a place where there is none of that infrastructure they grew up with. They have to start over. Any commodities, amenities, or luxuries they want, they have to make them from scratch. Well, I'm not talking about the 19th century Mormon pioneers. They were linked to global networks of migration and industrialized trade that supplied them, if slowly, with food, cloth, various kinds of metal goods, and new recruits. I'm talking about Lehi's party, who had none of that. What did they have? They had probably about 8 years to practice a Bedouin lifestyle, although several of those 8 years might have been staying put in one place, but nevertheless, it would have trained them in resilience and resourcefulness. They had a leader, Nephi, who had proven himself a capable metallurgist, smith, and carpenter. They had literacy and a tradition of bilingual learning. They had an ancient record, a curious, miraculous artifact, and a cosmic sense of mission. With these, they set out to build an ideal civilization in a place where, as far as we know, they were totally alone and unaided. So they set to, with hard work, ingenuity, skill. Nephi, in his secondary account, made 30 years after the events happened. That's important to remember. He reports admirable success in bringing their wild new home into some resemblance to the standard of living of the old country. But still, this is a very small group, especially after the party splits in two and Nephi flees with his followers, leaving the Lamanites apparently without any skill in working metals. We might estimate the Nephite group at the time of the skill to be around 30 people. This is a very tight-knit group. They have aspirations and pretensions to become a people. They are going to divide themselves into tribes, but we could call them a clan, maybe more like what anthropologists call a band for hunter-gatherer populations. And they're starting over yet again. They've had to uproot themselves and start, and then they've had to leave the larger group, and now they're starting over again with the threat of hostility from the other group, who by now are probably more numerous, or at least soon will be more numerous. It has been suggested that the reason that the Lamanites quickly become more numerous than the Nephites is because the Lamanites quickly intermarry with native populations. Maybe. But imagine what it would be like to grow up in this group, starting out the size of a hunter-gatherer band, but not stably evolved as such. It's a group sundered from civilization with aspirations to grow into a new civilization. Imagine how it would be to have this world be the only one you know. Imagine how your sense of scale would be. I spent 2 years in Puerto Rico as a missionary, and despite how tiny it looks on a world map, while I was there even for 2 years, my sense of scale shrank to fit its confines. The early Nephites had a keen sense of being cut off from the larger world, from the mother tree, and of their lonesome state, as Jacob so poignantly put it later on in his record. And he writes this apparently near the end of his own life, so this is a couple of generations into their experiment. Jacob and Joseph were ideal priests and teachers for the young colony. Spending their formative years as desert hunters would have given them time for study and learning from their elders and from the brass, or rather bronze, plates, time which I expect would have been in shorter supply once the colony started trying to build a mixed agrarian pastoral economy in the New World. Imagine growing up in the New World, hearing stories, sermons, and prophecies about places you've never seen and never will. We might want to compare it to the experience of settlers in the modern American colonial period, or even medieval Europe, except that a medieval European had at least a chance of making a journey to Jerusalem, which a Nephite never could. Keeping up a sense of being the righteous branch broken from the main tree could not have been simple or easy, as is plain to see from the terse record. Let's look at the first 2 chapters of the Book of Jacob, especially the second. I'm not going to read them here. because you can and should read them, and indeed polygamy denials in the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and adjacent, they're constantly pointing to Jacob too as God's unequivocal condemnation of polygamy, which again, like I was talking about in my previous video, is this naive way of reading scripture. God says, because it's on the pages of the book. We're not told how long it was after Nephi's death that Jacob noted with alarm the moral deviation of the people and gave them his blistering rebuke. It might have been soon after, or it might have taken a few years for the problem to get serious enough for him to intervene. Personally, I imagine that he preached this sermon rather soon after Nephi had died, but in any case, this society, still so tiny and precarious, came to a crisis that threatened its destruction. I want to reflect on how the stage was set for a peculiar concern about proper sexual relations that would haunt Nephite culture for centuries to come. In the second generation of this group, there had to be marriages between cousins. Even if Zoram and his wife produced enough children to supply spouses for Nephi's and Sam's children, as well as Jacob and Joseph, the couples still would share consanguinity through Ishmael's daughters. Jacob names 4 tribes among the Nephites. He doesn't include Sam as a head of a tribe, from which it has been surmised that Sam had all daughters, and therefore his name wouldn't have passed, and his daughters would have married into other tribes. The families of Sam, Nephi, and Zoram look like they would be roughly contemporary in their reproduction, so that marrying their children with each other would mean unions between cousins, with an incentive to pair Zoram's children equally with the brothers' children as much as was possible. But Jacob and Joseph arrived late, and yet were named as heads of tribes. Their wives might have been daughters born to Ishmael early in the wandering, and possibly older than them, or daughters of Zoram. Otherwise they would have had to marry their own blood nieces. Those crucial first generations had to walk a knife edge to avoid either extinction by failure to reproduce, or the normalization or even the institution of incest. The question of who married whom, and therefore who produced children with whom, had to be even more carefully governed than it would have been in the homeland their progenitors had left, even more so than in the world of the patriarchs. I don't see how individual preference could have counted for much in these first generations. Matches would be made by calculations much more pressing than your feelings. I don't know what it would be like to grow up in such a small and lonely world. But if the only prospects for mating were my cousins, I wonder what kind of inhibitions I might feel about marrying them. I'm aware of instances of first cousins marrying. I have at least one such couple in my own family tree. In fact, in 17th century New Mexico, it was so common for people who were some kind of cousins to seek marriages that there was a whole archive produced of ancestral investigations conducted by clergy to determine whether they were far enough apart in their relation that the marriage could be permissible. But it would help for them to grow up without too much familial closeness. This makes the early delineation of ites, when there are still so few of them, make much more sense and speaks to some wisdom on the part of the founders. If Nephi's family and Zoram's family each live in their separate house and call themselves as if part of separate tribes, the psychological effect of those distinctions would help encourage more willingness to marry those whom you might otherwise regard as close relatives. The idea of going to colonize a new world easily summons fantasies of some kind of reset of sexual mores. If a theoretical colony consisted of between 10 and 20 unrelated couples, and they all decided to live in a polyamorous free-for-all, that would prove emotionally and socially unstable. But at least it would not have the genetic danger that free love would present to the nascent Nephite nation. To cast off the shackles of oppressive sexual morality and live riotous lives of pleasure in the New World would be a desire more readily imputed to the Lamanites with their resentment of Nephi's rules, and yet Jacob reports the opposite where this is concerned. Which raises a question in my mind: how does he know what the Lamanites were like if they are separated from them at this time? Is he going by memory of his observations of them before the split, or does he find it expedient to tell the Nephites something that will goad them? And it's immaterial what the Lamanite family structure factually was like at this time. We don't have to take his words as positive proof of what the Lamanite family structure was at this time, because he might simply not be letting the truth get in the way of a good sermon. Jacob writes that the early Nephite men wanted to expand their sexual options because of the examples of David and Solomon, not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He mentions this side by side with their pride in their material wealth. And it's clear to me that these two sins go together integrally. Remember, this small group has an aspiration to greatness and to sophistication. These people have detailed records of the chosen people whom they firmly count as their ancestors, including probably tantalizing accounts of the splendors of the ancient kingdom of Israel. From what I understand, they would not have had the Deuteronomistic history as we have it in the Old Testament, but they would have had some form of recording the events and stories that later got written down into the Deuteronomistic history. Recall how one of Jacob's earlier sermons in 2 Nephi chapter 9 condemns the pride of both the rich and those who, being learned, think they are wise. This small group would naturally carry with them a great deal of pride in their abilities of building, adorning, and particularly of metalwork. It is no surprise that, right at the start, there were those among them who, reading in the ancient records brought from the mythical land of their glorious ancestors, would get carried away by a sense of their own wisdom and misunderstand what they read. In aspiring to the wealth and sophistication of their glorious ancestors, those who managed to accrue even the most rudimentary of status symbols, recall that the sense of scale would be distorted. They could easily get notions of being big men who deserved to attract not only followings of retainers but multiple wives as well. Polygyny arises naturally in human societies, but it is not practical for more than a minority of men. In this society, the supply of mates was critically limited to begin with. An article at Book of Mormon Central estimates a Nephite population in the dozens at the time of Jacob's ministry. If I run a very optimistic scenario, I come up with an estimated figure of somewhere around 300, which is probably way too high. I welcome any correction from anyone who understands such things better than I do. But that's still a very small group. Think about what it would take to wrest the social order of such a small group into one that allowed multiple wives, even if only for the top elite men, and think about what that would cause. It would mean that, just as the people are multiplying to numbers that would begin to allow for more individual freedom in choosing a mate, the pool of women available would be reduced. Imagine, again this is probably way too high, a mating pool of about 80 men and women each in the fertile time of life. If 8 of those men each married 4 of the women, then a quarter of the single men of this tiny society would be locked out of marriage, leading to the well-known social ills of such frustration and alienation. We can imagine the leaders of this tiny Nephite society might well find a way to dispose of their unwanted young men by sending them to pick fights with the Lamanites. That would turn the nascent Nephite civilization into a warrior society, depending on constant raiding and calculated expendability of most of its warriors for its sorry excuse for stability. In the stable societies, where polygyny naturally arises, only a minority of elite men can maintain the largesse to support multiple wives, but in this early period of exuberant growth among the Nephites, far more men would aspire to that status than could attain or sustain it. That would mean, in addition to killing off many of their fertile young men by sending them to needless war against the Lamanites, the Nephite men would turn on each other too. Brother would fight against brother. The horrific self-destruction that finally ended this civilization 1,000 years in the future would, in this scenario, likely abort it before it even reached its first century. In a group still this small, allowing the men to indulge their sexual appetites would incentivize the grooming of young girls to become plural wives for the successful elites, probably to be claimed before they reached puberty, maybe as soon as they were born. Men of lower status would have incentive to resort to kidnapping, extortion, and yes, incest to grab a share of the shrinking opportunity to mate. So, when Jacob talks about women and children with tender and delicate feelings, broken hearts because of the men's bad example, about the Lord delighting in the chastity of women, it's clear to me that this is referring in large part to adolescent girls, and maybe younger. The word girl doesn't appear in the book at all, and our concepts of childhood and adolescence are quite recent products of historical changes and cultural divisions of ages, which we should not expect the Nephites to conform to. Therefore, women may well indicate girls who had barely entered puberty, and so Jacob's words make sense in an especially chilling way. Leading captive the daughters of the people because of their tenderness, to me clearly indicates a nefarious project to groom young girls to become thoroughly unnecessary plural wives and concubines in a social order that would destroy trust and stability. It might be hard for a woman in the first world of today to imagine what it might be like growing up as a girl in such a precarious circumstance as prevailed in Jacob's day. You would have every right to demand the strictest moral standards of honor and self-control from the men, because you would be dependent on them for your safety and security, to an extent that is hard to imagine in our state-supported comfort. From a post-industrial weird perspective, Jacob too can easily seem like one more example of the big bad patriarchy keeping women down, conditioning them to deny their sexuality. Don't laugh, I've heard it said. It's a lazy and indefensible judgment. For one thing, the Nephite women are the agents that bring about God's rebuke to the people. In my imagination, I expand on this. I think of the care that would have had to be taken in matchmaking during those first generations. I think of the extraordinary prescience, clarity, and precision that Nephi reports in the revelations that guided the pioneering party. I consider Jacob's report, again in the context of building a new civilization from scratch. In the 4th chapter, wherefore we search the prophets, and we have many revelations in the spirit of prophecy. And having all these witnesses, we obtain a hope, and our faith become unshaken, insomuch that we truly can command in the name of Jesus, and the very trees obey us, or the mountains, or the waves of the sea. And I choose to believe that such gifts of prophecy flowed abundantly to the women of the Nephites in those first generations, giving them guidance in arranging the marriages that would produce the healthiest offspring. I choose to believe that their exceeding tender and chaste and delicate feelings not only included the natural emotional state of barely pubescent girls, but also indicated the Nephite women's wisdom and understanding as sexual agents in making the most careful mating choices they could, aided by revelation, knowing that the future of their society depended on them. Therefore, of course, they should be alarmed and disgusted if some of the men among them began to betray the trust that was vital in such a small and vulnerable community. Tenderness of feeling would be consistent with that trust. Everything depends on everyone living together peacefully, cooperating, sharing, making the proper arrangements for reproduction. The slightest intrusion of envy and strife threatened to thrust the vulnerable young community down to a dystopian hell, a sore curse even unto destruction. Jacob's words could not possibly be too stern or too harsh in nipping this danger in the bud. Now the zeal and rigor which give his sermon such a hellfire flare makes so much more sense. What a wonder was brought about by the agency of women, and maybe especially girls. Their cries ascended to God and brought down God's wrath on the men who threatened to betray them. The easily denounced incongruity between Jacob's strict prohibition of polygamy and the adoption of it in the early restored church in the 19th century is readily explained by considering the radical differences between those two groups. The questions of how well the experiment went in the 19th century American frontier are beyond my ability to tackle right now. But it is worth repeating and emphasizing that the American frontier of the 19th century AD was a completely different world than what the Nephites faced in the 6th century BC. Jacob's directions to the early Nephites were specific to his time and place. The Book of Mormon rewards careful reading, including reading between the lines, examination, and thought. And it is full of testament to the trials of mortality, loneliness, danger, betrayal, sorrow, horror, disaster, existential threats. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe. Please like. I desire comments. I welcome well thought out comments. And I will talk to you later.